trans activism tells us all the time that no one can tell you what your gender identity is, only you can know. And if that is the basis on which people are getting access to certain spaces where women are vulnerable, it's just way too open to malfeasance.
Players are not at the gate. They're not at the gate. They're well inside.
Good evening and welcome to Mr. Matters. I hope you're all surviving out there in clown world.
I'm tired of shouting trans women are women and trans men are men.
Yeah, we're sick of that too. Stop doing it. I've got a quickish video for you today. I felt like I had to dip into this subject. So today it's about Kathleen Stock speaking at the Oxford Union. And again, we have another example of a woman not being able to give her point of view because trans activists disapprove of it. So we're going to silence women once again, or at least try and silence women. Let's get into it and see what this shit show is. Now, that's not even a word or a sentence, is it? A quick summary of who Kathleen Stock is. Kathleen is a writer and philosopher from Britain. She was a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex until 2021. She has published academic work on aesthetics, fiction, imagination, sexual objectification, and sexual orientation. She has been in the news, though, for being critical of the gender ideology movement, and because of how intolerant and insufferable this movement is, she was ousted from her position, and everyone around the world saw this. It was another scalp given by the trans activists. She seems like a very genuine, lovely lady. She doesn't seem like some bigot that is trying to rip up trans rights. She's just a person that doesn't agree, like most people. This is what we have to understand, people. The majority of all our Western countries agree with people like Kathleen Stock. It's a minority of crazies that take up all the bandwidth. So we think it's this majority of people that are for this fucking crazy gender ideology nonsense, dear self and non-binary, they, them, me. But it's not. It's a small minority that has just a massive megaphone. And as reassuring as that is, it's not really anything to celebrate, because we still have incidences like this where people like Kathleen are invited to speak at Oxford Union for a debate, and everyone loses their little tiny minds that she's going to talk. So we might have a minority that think this, but they certainly have the power to shut these things down, to cancel people, to deplatform people, and to steal people's free speech. And as Christopher Hitchens used to remind us,
What they say is, it's not just the right of the person who speaks to be heard. It is the right of everyone in the audience to listen and to hear. And every time you silence somebody, you make yourself a prisoner of your own action, because you deny yourself the right to hear something. In other words, your own right to hear and be exposed is as much involved in all these cases as is the right of the other to voice his or her view.
if you do not want to hear it, no one is forcing you to hear it. You are forcing other people to not have the ability to hear something that they want to hear. If you don't see the problem with that, your brain needs to be reorientated, because if you can take someone's free speech away, you have no leg to stand on if your free speech is taken away. Is free speech for all or free speech for no one? But we all know anyway why these people don't want debate and don't want to have people talk and don't want to have counter arguments and a Q&A and a back and forth. It's because their ideology is built on sand. It's paper in the rain. There is no arguments that make sense. It's feelings based. It's not scientific, logic, reason based. It is nonsense. So they don't debate because they can't debate, because there is no argument to ignore biology and to put women and children in dangerous scenarios and unfair scenarios and scenarios they do not want to be in. This is not saying all trans people are predators, but it means the law are surrounding the self-ID and trans women being in women's spaces causes a problem. We need to address this problem. These people like Kathleen Stock are addressing these problems, and the trans activists do not give a shit. They don't care about women. They care about a subsect of the population that has it way better than they actually want to admit. Everything is okay for these people. They are literally the golden balls of the era. You are safe. We are trying to protect women and children. They aren't just some offshoot rejects that we put to the side of the road. They are central to this debate. We need to make sure women's sports are fair and safe, women's spaces are safe, and that predatory men don't self-ID to go into women's spaces to cause acts of sexual assault, violence and rape. That's what we need to protect. That is essential. But obviously this gets twisted and turned and manipulated and propagandized out into the world by these trans activists as we want to erase trans people, that we want to wipe them off the face of the earth, that there's a genocide. Just absolute lies, again, because they cannot address the actual points made by people like Kathleen Stock, so they have to shut her down so they don't have to have an argument for these points that the rest of the country also shares and wants an answer to. That is the crux of it. And here we are. There is a girl called Riz Possnett, who is a they, them, me, or a woman, as we call them. And she did an act of revolutionary bravery. She went to the Oxford student debate and glued herself to a table. Yeah. And you think you're doing something with your life. What have you glued yourself to, hey? How have you turned the dial of political debate by gluing yourself to something? I mean, obviously embarrassing, stupid, juvenile, does nothing, is solely to make the person feel good, is solely to be on all the Piers Morgans and shows afterwards talking about the nonsense of transgenocide and Kathleen Stock is evil. Just pathetic and boring. And again, you had a perfect opportunity to destroy her in the debate and you stepped to the side and decided to do some stunt that means nothing, that does nothing, and is solely used as an ego rub and to get in good with your friends. So let's briefly look at some of the talking points Kathleen said at the Oxford debate, and let's look at Riz's response to this hate speech.
Britain is quite a liberal society, and we have far more racist violence than we have transphobic violence in this country. So that is a message that's come through trans activism and has been repeated uncritically by many a media outlet, and is backed up by Stonewall surveys where they ask people, have you ever felt aggressed? You know, so a lot of those surveys are based on people's reported feelings, and that's not the way you would normally look at levels of violence. It's complicated because obviously convictions are not going to absolutely represent crime, but certainly you shouldn't just go around to a bunch of people and say, do you feel like you've been a victim of a hate crime lately? And particularly not when you're telling them that a hate crime is to misgender them. So, in other words, I would push back a bit on that first assumption, but let's say that I grant you that assumption. I'm afraid it doesn't follow that people that are subject to violence are not violent. I think you need to talk to some criminologists.
Fuck off a minute, are trans activists violent?
J.K. Rowling fucking dies.
And see, reality bites them on the ass, because Kathleen is saying even if there is violence against trans people, which has been debunked, check out Is There a Trans Genocide video, even if you concede there is violence against trans people, there isn't. It doesn't mean they aren't the aggressors at some points as well, as demonstrated by that clip. They clearly are a violent organization, these trans activists. They engage in violence, death threats, rape threats, all of the threats and assaults you could imagine. They do this. This is Kathleen laying that out, and people have been protesting the truth because this is a true fact and they didn't want her to speak at this debate. It's madness. The truth matters. This is true. Deal with it.
If you take the number of trans women in prison in Britain and you get the same stat in the US statistics, at least 50% are in there for sexual assault. So, and then that's a higher rate than the average male. Now, that is not to say that I am saying that there's something about being a trans woman that makes you violent. I am saying that we need to look at those. You asked me to provide some evidence. I provided you some evidence. I hate to be the one that keeps having to tell people this sort of thing because it absolutely, you know, is the sort of thing that these people outside totally misunderstand about what I'm saying. But somebody has to say it. You can go and look at the stats yourself.
This is why people like Kathleen are so dangerous, because they actually have the facts and the statistics to back up what they're talking about. This is, again, another hate fact. This is just demonstrating the percentage of trans people that are in prison for a certain offence and how that might actually matter when we're making laws to let trans people enter women's spaces when they are biological men. How does that not make sense to people? That would be safeguarding. That would be making sure people are safe. And when Kathleen makes a point of saying, I'm not saying all trans people are going to sexually assault people, she's just stating a fact that actually has implication on laws that we should look into. When she even goes out of her way to explain that, and they still purposely take it out of context, say it's about transgenocide, about trans people being erased. When they say that when it's concerning safeguarding and sexual assault rapes, you have to at some point wonder why that is. Why do they not want to protect women and children in women's spaces? Why? Why, when 50% of trans people in jail are there for sexual assault, why does that not matter to you? You have to ask that question. It looks dodgy.
Safeguarding is an area where you're supposed to be quite paranoid. You know, you're supposed to have extra safeguarding in, even though not every male predates, but you still say in the safeguarding of children, you do a lot of things to stop that paedophile from becoming the nursery teacher or whatever, extra things. And that's not to say that every nursery teacher is a paedophile, ridiculous.
And this is just following on from the last point. Why are you against safeguarding women and children? Like she says, there should be more safeguarding. Men have had to deal with this since inception. Women have their own spaces. We protect women and children. We do not want men, bad actors, going into women's spaces and assaulting and making people feel uncomfortable, or, God forbid, rape or horrendous crimes that could be committed. We want to limit that as much as possible, and that's the debate. So please tell me what you have a problem with. She has said it's clearly not all trans people that are going to be predators. People can take advantage of this. Let's make sure all the loopholes are closed so women and children are protected. What is the problem with that? Well, let's see what Riz has a problem with, that she felt so strongly to do a childish act like gluing herself to a desk.
What's all this censorship about?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, this is students exercising their own free speech.
No, it's not, and this is the Orwellian speak of these people. Shutting down other people's speech isn't free speech. You can use your free speech to criticize, to ask questions, to protest, but your free speech isn't shutting someone else down because you're infringing on their rights. Okay?
Right? Like, she has been platformed by this institution. Students have consistently said, we don't think she should speak here, we don't want her here, because her views are part of a broader hate campaign and moral panic that's really damaging the lives of trans people.
Because you can't walk all over women and children, and because you can't enter women's spaces and women's sports, that is trampling on trans people. What you want is trampling on women and children. So let's have a little bit of a scope and a bit of gauge about who's trying to shit on who here.
So students have voted that they don't want her here in their college institutions, in the student union, and now the university have overruled that vote.
Good, they should. This is a school. You're students, you ain't the teachers. You don't get to decide the curriculum. You can't say, oh, we voted against taking maths, so maths is off the curriculum now. No, if you don't want to hear it, don't go. But for those who do want to hear it, it should be available to them. And people who disagree should go. That is a good thing. Your mind will expand. You'll get your ideas out there. There'll be a back and forth. You don't get to decide the curriculum, okay? Good, Oxford did this. Free speech is way more important than whatever students happen to be there at the time. And let's cut the shit that all students voted against it. It's you voted against it, a subsect that believes this nonsense. Other people wanted to hear it, so the tyranny of the majority doesn't trump the people who did want to hear. Just don't go and let the people who did want to hear go.
I don't know if you've read her book, Riz. She consistently misgenders people. She talks about whether trans ideology should exist, whether trans people should be part of the LGBTQ community.
Can you imagine thinking that is beyond the pale to think those three things? I mean, that is the debate going on. You have excommunicated yourself from that debate, so you're just talking to your friends here. But the world is discussing what this trans ideology means for the rest of the world. You know, the majority of people who deal with it. And no one's saying shit on trans people or fuck trans people or they don't matter or whatever. We're trying to gauge how we can protect women and children in a world now where violent trans activists will railroad women and children for their own selfish needs. And we believe there should be a balance, and fundamentally women and children should be protected. So that's all I've got time for you today. This was a ridiculous debate and another example how free speech is just not important to people. And if they really lived in a tyrannical environment, they would have no free speech to espouse the views they do. They aren't getting deplatformed. The people criticizing them, they're getting deplatformed. Make sure you like and subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss the next video, and I will see you in the next one. Stay free.
I'm a teacher and I'm trans.